The twin suns hung low, blazing red and gold across the endless desert. Sand stretched to the horizon, glowing like fire in the late afternoon, and the wind carried a burning taste of iron and dust. Rovan Hale pushed the last lever of his broken salvage crawler, cursing under his breath as the machine wheezed and groaned. The convoy had left him here hours ago, stranded and abandoned. He had no fuel, no water, and the radios were silent. If he didn't move soon, the suns would cook him alive before night came. Rovan scanned the horizon with narrowed eyes. Heat shimmered off the sand, making the world seem to twist and blur. That's when he saw it, an irregular heat signature beneath the dunes, pulsing faintly, almost rhythmic. It was too precise to be natural. He froze, unsure if he should investigate. Most humans would have ignored it and tried to limp to safety. But Rovan wasn't like most humans. He grabbed his tool pack and trudged toward the glow. Each step burned his boots and sweat ran down his neck, but the instinct to survive, and to find answers, was stronger than exhaustion. He dug through the sand carefully, uncovering a metal shell, cracked and scorched. As he brushed away the grit, he realized it was not just a shell but part of a cocoon, glimmering with alien energy. There were two more buried nearby. All three were damaged, leaking faint light and warmth. Something alive stirred inside them. Suddenly the top of one cocoon cracked and a small, scaled head emerged. Its eyes were wide, glowing faintly in the red light. Rovan froze. The creature did not growl or attack. It simply stared at him, trembling as if it had been waiting. It had wings, tiny and folded, and claws curled weakly in the sand. The other cocoons shook slightly, but no other creatures came out. They were too small, too fragile. Rovan's mind raced. Dragons were thought to be extinct in this sector, or myths at best. And yet, here were three of them, children of something powerful, left to die. He knelt beside the first cocoon, checking the life signs with his scanner. They were faint but stable enough if he acted quickly. "Don't worry," he whispered. "I won't let you die." Using his tools, he began repairing the cocoons. Sparks flew as he patched metal edges and rewired small circuits. The sand clung to everything and the heat made it hard to focus. But as he worked, the smallest dragon, its scales silver blue, touched his hand with its tiny claw. A shock ran through him, not painful but alive. It was almost as if the creature was thanking him. Rovan's heart pounded. He had never bonded with anything like this before. Hours passed. The sun sank lower and the desert began to chill. The first cocoon stabilized and the dragon inside twitched, testing its wings. Rovan wiped sweat from his brow. He had no idea who these creatures were or why they had been left here, but he knew one thing. Someone had wanted them dead. He could feel it in the way the shells had been smashed, in the scorch marks around them. These were no accidents. Movement flickered at the edge of his vision. He turned to see a shadow drifting over the dunes. Scavenger drones, small but lethal, hovered nearby, scanning the area. They were drawn to heat, to life signs. Rovan's stomach tightened. If they discovered the dragons, it would be over. He acted quickly, setting up a small trap. Using old wiring and a leftover power cell, he rigged a makeshift EMP burst. When the drones hovered close, they sparked and fell from the sky in a shower of metal. The dragons hissed and flapped their tiny wings at the falling machines. Rovan breathed heavily. This was the first fight he had won in hours, but he knew it would not be the last. Night fell fast. The desert, once bright and unforgiving, became dark and cold. The stars burned overhead, distant and indifferent. Rovan built a small shelter from scrap metal and sand. Inside, the dragons huddled, curling together for warmth. He fed them tiny rations of water and synthesized protein paste from his packs, careful to keep them alive. As he watched them sleep, one of the dragons moved slightly in his direction, its eyes blinking open. A faint psychic pulse brushed against his mind, not words but images. Flashes of fire, of a fleet burning, of a figure in gold and black, screaming orders he couldn't understand. Then a warning: "They're coming." Rovan shivered, but he refused to panic. He tightened the straps of his tool belt and checked the shelter. He had no fleet, no allies, no weapons, only his wits and his machines. But he also had these creatures, small and fragile, yet alive. Somehow, against everything, he had found hope in the desert. He whispered, "I'll get you out of here. I promise." Above him, the twin suns set behind the dunes, leaving streaks of red and gold across the horizon. Somewhere far away, a warship drifted silently, watching. The galaxy had noticed a human, abandoned and alone, who was trying to protect what no one else had the courage to save. And beneath the burning sky, a new bond was forming. one that could change everything if they survived the night. Rovan did not sleep. He could not. He watched the horizon, the stars, and the small forms of the dragon heirs huddled beside him. Every shadow in the desert could be a threat, but he had learned something vital in those hours. Survival was not just about being strong. Sometimes, survival was about daring to care when everyone else had turned away. And so, under the twin suns of a lonely desert, a human mechanic and 3 dragon children waited for dawn, ready to face whatever came next. Night had fully fallen, and the desert had turned cold and silent. Rovan Hale sat beside the small fire he had built, watching the 3 dragon heirs as they curled close together for warmth. Their scales shimmered faintly under the starlight, colors shifting with each soft breath. They were small now, but even in their fragile forms, Rovan could sense something ancient and powerful in them. Something that did not belong to this desert, or to any ordinary world. He had patched the last cocoon with what little tools and materials he had, but questions burned in his mind. Who were they? Why had someone left them here? And how had they survived the fire that had burned the convoy that abandoned him? Rovan reached out slowly to the eldest dragon, whose silver scales glimmered faintly blue. Its eyes opened and for a moment he felt a pull in his mind, a strange connection. Images flashed before him. A palace orbiting a distant star, a figure in regal armor, and creatures larger and stronger than any dragon he had ever read about. The dragon hissed softly, then made a small, almost musical noise. A flicker of understanding passed through Rovan. These creatures were not just animals. They were heirs. Royal heirs. He could feel it in the weight of their gaze and the faint pulse of power that surrounded them. The smallest, Veilrix, nudged his hand gently, almost like a child testing trust. Rovan spent the rest of the night studying the fragments of information he could gather from the damaged cocoons. Embedded in their shells were small holographic chips, corrupted but partially functional. He held one to his scanner and it flickered to life. Shards of a story appeared. A dragon prince betrayed, a fleet destroyed from within, heirs hidden to survive assassination, and an ancient prophecy of dragons raised by another species. The images were broken and unclear, but the message was undeniable. These hatchlings were the last hope of a bloodline thought extinct. Morning came slowly, painting the desert in pale gold. Rovan had managed to create a small shelter from scrap metal and sand, enough to hide them from passing patrols. He set to work repairing what little remained of his crawler and salvaging anything useful from the wreckage around them. As he worked, he talked softly to the dragons, explaining simple things: how to stay still when danger comes, how to watch without being seen, and how he would protect them no matter what. By midday, the desert heat had returned, relentless and punishing. While fetching water from a small reserve he had salvaged, Rovan noticed movement in the distance. Scavenger drones, the same kind he had fought the night before, hovered over the dunes, scanning for heat. Panic clawed at him, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had an idea. Rovan began setting up a decoy using broken metal panels and heat emitters. The dragons watched curiously, tilting their heads, wings flicking nervously. When the drones approached, the decoy activated, sending a strong heat signature that drew them away from the shelter. Sparks and static filled the air as the drones collided with the improvised traps, disabling several before the rest retreated. The dragons chirped and hissed in relief, and Rovan allowed himself a tired smile. For now they were safe. As night fell again, Rovan sat beside the fire, exhausted but vigilant. The dragons had begun to interact with him in small ways. Veilrix curled around his arm, sending faint pulses of emotion through the bond that had formed. Another, taller one named Zareth, flapped its tiny wings experimentally, testing strength and balance. The eldest, Lorana, watched the horizon with piercing eyes, as if aware that danger lurked even beyond the stars. Rovan realized that these creatures were learning from him just as much as he was learning from them. They did not speak in words but in gestures, in psychic nudges, in tiny acts of trust and curiosity. He could feel their minds reaching for his, trying to understand the human who had chosen to save them instead of walking away like everyone else. The night grew colder, and the desert wind carried the faint scent of distant storms. Rovan thought of the galaxy beyond the dunes, the fleets, the armies, the assassins who would have killed the heirs without a second thought. He shivered but did not give in to fear. He had discovered the truth. These dragons were not just survivors. They were symbols of something greater, something the galaxy had forgotten. They were proof that even the smallest, most abandoned creatures could hold the future of entire worlds in their claws. Hours passed and sleep came in short, restless waves. Rovan dreamed of a golden palace in orbit, of the prince who had been betrayed, and of the dragon heirs growing strong under his care. He awoke to find Veilrix gently nudging his hand, and the bond pulsed stronger than ever. The young dragon's mind reached out again, showing glimpses of fleets, of shadows, of enemies who would come. They were not safe yet. Not even close. Rovan rose, stretching stiff muscles and weary bones. He packed supplies and checked the shelter, ensuring that nothing could alert any other scavengers. He spoke softly to the dragons, reassuring them. "We will move. I promise. No one will hurt you while I'm here." As the first light of dawn painted the desert sands with fire-like glow, Rovan Hale, a human left to die, had found purpose. He had found responsibility beyond survival, and he had found companions unlike any the galaxy had ever seen. The dragon heirs, fragile and young, had entrusted their lives to him. And Rovan, with nothing but skill, courage and stubborn determination, would not let them be taken. Far above, unseen sensors flickered in orbit, recording the small human and his dragon wards. Somewhere far away, powerful eyes watched and noted the anomaly. The galaxy had begun to notice. A human was protecting dragon heirs. And in doing so, he had changed the rules of survival in ways no one yet understood. For the first time since he had been abandoned in the desert, Rovan felt something more than fear. He felt hope. And he knew that the secret of the dragon heirs was now his secret too. Rovan Hale's freighter shuddered as it left the desert planet behind, barely holding together after days of repairs. The dragon heirs were huddled in the small cargo bay, their wings folded tightly and scales faintly glowing in the dim lights. Veilrix, the youngest, pressed against Rovan's side, sending a faint pulse through the psychic bond they shared. He could feel the child's nervous energy and it mirrored his own. They had escaped the desert, but the galaxy beyond was far more dangerous than the empty sands they had left behind. Rovan had patched the ship as best he could, but it was slow and clunky. Every mile they traveled, he worried the ship's hull might fail or that they would be detected by someone who had been hunting the dragon heirs since their birth. He studied the navigation charts, planning a route through abandoned trade lanes, hoping to avoid patrols and bounty hunters. The children had begun to understand basic commands, and they listened carefully as he explained the importance of silence and hiding, though their instincts to explore and test their wings made it difficult. By the second day the first attack came. Sensors beeped urgently, warning of multiple fast-moving ships approaching from behind. Rovan cursed, scanning the display. A pirate fleet, small but heavily armed, had picked up their heat signature. The dragons reacted instantly, ears and eyes flicking to the approaching threat. Veilrix hissed softly, a warning, while the others tensed. Rovan had no weapons, only a few improvised tools and a lot of hope. He tried communicating with the pirates, but they were merciless, seeking the bounty on the heirs' heads. Panic threatened to overtake him, but he took a deep breath and focused. He could not rely on luck. He had to think like a human and fight like a mechanic. He activated the ship's remaining thrusters, lurching to one side to dodge the first volley of lasers. Sparks flew as the shields took the brunt of the fire. The dragons pressed close, and Rovan realized he had no time to repair the shields further. Desperate, he reached out with the psychic link he had unknowingly built with Veilrix. He did not know if it would work, but he needed help. A surge of energy responded. Veilrix flapped its tiny wings and released a wave of heat and force that slammed into the pirate's lead ship. The other heirs followed instinctively, directing energy in precise, controlled bursts that disrupted engines and shields without destroying the vessels. Rovan's eyes widened. The dragons were acting with purpose, almost like trained pilots, but they were children. He guided them verbally and with hand signals, coordinating their attacks. Within minutes, the pirates' formation was in chaos. Ships collided, engines failed, and the rest retreated, unable to follow through. Rovan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The dragons chirped softly, wings trembling from the effort but clearly aware that they had saved themselves. It was the first time they had fought in the open and it had worked. They had survived. For a moment, silence returned to the ship, broken only by the low hum of the engines. Rovan looked at the three heirs and they looked back, eyes glowing faintly. Something had changed. They had begun to understand not only the danger but also the power they held. And they were learning from him, not just surviving but thinking, planning, and acting in ways that were unpredictable. Rovan knew this would not be the last time the galaxy came for them. Word traveled fast among pirates, bounty hunters, and empires. The heirs' survival had become a signal to those who sought control or profit. But Rovan also understood something new. These dragons, despite their size and age, were not just tools or weapons. They were children. They were intelligent, curious, and capable of choosing their own path. And if he taught them well, they might survive the galaxy in ways no one expected. The next day, Rovan found a quiet system with a small, abandoned station. He docked the freighter and began repairs again, scavenging parts from the station and salvaging energy cells. The heirs explored carefully, testing their wings in small chambers and learning to control their abilities. Veilrix nudged Rovan repeatedly, showing interest in how he fixed machines. It was clear the bond was growing stronger, not just survival but trust and understanding. While working, Rovan found old records in the station's archives. They mentioned the bloodline of a dragon prince whose heirs had been marked for extinction. The prophecy that surrounded them spoke of dragons who could surpass their own kind if raised by another species. It seemed impossible, but he had seen the evidence with his own eyes. These small dragons were not just survivors, they were the beginning of something new. But the galaxy would not wait. By the third day, scanners picked up distant warships. They were larger, more organized, and closer than the pirates. Rovan's stomach tightened. He had no chance in a direct fight. Yet, he also knew something important. The heirs were ready to help him, but not as weapons of destruction. They had learned to defend, to protect, and to act with strategy. That was a human lesson that no fleet had ever taught dragons. The freighter lifted off again, dodging between asteroid fields and narrow canyons. Each move was tense, each decision crucial. The heirs had begun to trust his judgment completely, following his instructions without hesitation. And when a warship opened fire, the dragons acted instinctively, disabling weapons and engines without taking life. Rovan realized something profound. Humans did not need dragons to conquer. Humans could teach dragons how to protect without domination. By the time the warships gave up the chase, Rovan was exhausted, and the heirs were panting and trembling from effort. Yet for the first time he felt a sense of accomplishment. They had survived another attack and he had guided them. Together they were stronger than the galaxy expected. As they drifted through the empty void, the stars glittering coldly around them, Rovan looked at the heirs. Veilrix blinked up at him, wings folded carefully, while Lyrana and Zareth rested nearby. A faint pulse of understanding passed through their bond. They had learned something new. The galaxy hunted them, yes, but together they could survive. And more than that, they could teach the galaxy a lesson it had never learned before. Rovan smiled tiredly. The journey was far from over. The galaxy was vast and the enemies were relentless. But for the first time he believed that a human and 3 dragon heirs could face it all, and maybe, just maybe, change it in ways no one had ever imagined. Rovan Hale's freighter drifted silently through the shadow of a large gas giant. The dragon heirs had grown stronger during their travels, their wings stretching wider and scales glinting with new patterns. Veilrix, once the smallest, now pulsed with energy and confidence, testing its powers even in the cramped cargo bay. Lyrana, the eldest, watched everything with a sharp intelligence, and Zareth was learning to coordinate movements with precision. Together they had survived pirate fleets and warships, and yet the galaxy still saw them as threats. Rovan had hoped to find a place to hide, a quiet world where the heirs could rest and grow. Instead, sensors picked up a fleet closing in. This time it was no pirates or rogue mercenaries, it was a galactic tribunal, a council of the most powerful species in the sector. Their message was clear: surrender the dragon heirs or face annihilation. Rovan tightened his grip on the ship's controls. He had no weapons, only his tools, his wits, and 3 dragon children who trusted him completely. They entered the tribunal's docking zone cautiously, pretending to comply. The freighter's small size drew curiosity, but not immediate attack. Rovan activated the shields and prepared for confrontation. As the doors opened, he and the heirs were escorted into a massive chamber, filled with representatives from dozens of alien species. Their eyes scanned the dragons with cold calculation, seeing only potential danger. Rovan stood tall, though his heart pounded. "These children are not weapons," he said plainly. "They are living beings and I am responsible for them." His voice echoed in the hall. Some council members murmured, others sneered. They had expected a human to comply silently, to hand over the heirs without argument. Instead, Rovan was speaking with courage. The tribunal demanded proof that the heirs were not dangerous. Rovan gestured and Veilrix stepped forward, wings folded, eyes steady. In a pulse of energy, Veilrix projected a vision into the chamber. Images of betrayal, of a dragon prince assassinated by his own council, of fleets destroyed by treachery. The heir's story unfolded silently, showing the tribunal what the galaxy had tried to erase. Some representatives gasped, others scowled. The evidence was undeniable. Suddenly an attack erupted. Assassin drones hidden in the chamber struck from the ceiling, their weapons aimed at the heirs. Rovan reacted instantly, pushing the dragons behind him and using improvised barriers to shield them. Sparks flew, metal twisted, and the chamber filled with smoke. The heirs acted on instinct, not to destroy but to disable. Lorana used a pulse of force to throw drones aside. Zareth coordinated with Veilrix to create protective barriers. They did not kill, they neutralized the threat. The tribunal members froze watching the display. This was unlike anything they had ever seen. Dragons trained and guided by a human, defending life without domination, without cruelty. Rovan realized something profound in that moment. He had taught them humanity, not through words but through action. He had shown them that power could protect rather than destroy. When the chamber cleared, the council faced him again. "Why should we believe you?" one representative demanded. "Why should these heirs follow you instead of their own species?" Rovan looked at the dragons. They were watching him, waiting. He took a deep breath. "Because no one else would. Because I chose to care when everyone else turned away. Because they trust me, and they have learned that protection is stronger than fear." His voice carried conviction. "If you want to know what makes a species strong, look at this bond. Look at what can survive when empathy guides action." The heirs stepped forward together. Veilrix's eyes pulsed, and a soft glow surrounded them. Lorana's wings stretched slightly, and Zareth lifted its head proudly. The council watched, realizing for the first time that the galaxy had misjudged humans. They were not the strongest, not the most numerous, not the most technologically advanced, but they could teach creatures far older and stronger to act with care, with strategy, and with courage. Rovan had changed the rules of survival in that chamber. By showing that a human could protect what others sought to destroy, he had shifted the balance of perception. The heirs were no longer simply dragons. They were symbols of a new order, guided not by bloodline alone, but by trust and choice. News of the chamber's events spread quickly. Humans were no longer seen as weak, abandoned, or insignificant. Across trade lanes and outposts, whispers grew. A human had saved the dragon heirs of a prince thought extinct. The story inspired both fear and admiration. Some saw humans as dangerous allies, others as unexpected protectors. The galaxy had taken notice, and the heirs, under Rovan's guidance, had begun to redefine what it meant to survive. The next days were tense. The heirs practiced flight in hidden hangars, learning to control their strength and abilities while maintaining the bond with Rovan. He continued to teach them human skills, repair, observation, planning, while they taught him patience, awareness, and trust. They were no longer just students. They were partners, a family formed not by convention but by choice and survival. Eventually the tribunal offered terms. They could not destroy the heirs and they could not force compliance. Rovan had proved that the human approach, protecting, guiding, and teaching, was more effective than fear or domination. The heirs would be free to choose their path, guided by Rovan's human wisdom. The council grudgingly agreed, and the freighter left the system, carrying its unusual passengers into the void. As they traveled, Rovan looked at Veilrix, Lorana, and Zareth. They were changing, growing, and learning to navigate the galaxy not as tools of war but as guardians. He realized that his life, once abandoned and meaningless in the desert, had become something far greater. He was not just a mechanic or a survivor. He was the human who had changed dragon fate. The galaxy would remember this moment. Not because of fleets or battles, but because a single human had dared to stand for life, had protected the heirs when no one else would, and had shown dragons the power of trust and empathy. The stars themselves seemed to acknowledge it, glittering brighter as if in approval. Rovan smiled, exhausted but proud. The journey was far from over, but he knew one thing. Together they would continue to survive, to protect, and to teach the galaxy something it had long forgotten. A human could make a difference. A human could change the fate of dragons. And somewhere in the quiet hum of the freighter, the dragon heirs pulsed with energy and trust, ready to follow the human who had saved them, and to face whatever the galaxy dared to throw at them next. Years had passed since Rovan Hale had first rescued the dragon heirs from the desert. The freighter he had patched together with his own hands now carried a small crew of humans and dragons, traveling from system to system. Veilrix, Lorana, and Zareth had grown strong, their wings wide and powerful, and their scales shimmered in brilliant patterns that reflected their experiences. They were no longer small, frightened hatchlings. They were guardians of the galaxy, and everywhere they went, the stories of a human who saved dragon heirs traveled ahead of them. Rovan had not grown old in the same way humans usually did. The years had hardened him, yes, but they had also given him purpose. He repaired ships, helped settlements, and protected those who could not defend themselves. He taught the heirs to do the same, not to conquer, not to rule, but to protect. Every encounter with pirates, raiders, or corrupt fleets became a lesson for the heirs, showing them how humans acted in ways dragons had never learned. With planning, compassion, and courage, the galaxy began to change. Systems that had long suffered under warlords now saw dragons intervening to prevent conflicts. Empires that had thought humans weak began to treat them differently. Trade lanes once considered dangerous now had safe corridors because the heirs patrolled them, not for profit, not for glory, but because a human had taught them that protection was more important than power. On one particular world, a festival was held to honor the deeds of the dragon heirs. Statues were erected not of emperors or generals, but of a human mechanic holding a simple tool under twin suns, with dragons curled around him. Rovan watched quietly from the edge of the crowd, Veilrix perched on his shoulder and Lyrana standing proudly behind him. Zaretha's wings flicked once, signaling readiness and vigilance. People approached to thank him, not for wealth or battle, but for courage and heart. Rovan realized something profound. Humans were remembered not for what they destroyed but for what they chose to save. One day, while traveling through an unstable sector, a fleet attempted to ambush a nearby settlement. Rovan and the heirs intervened. The dragons moved with precision, disabling weapons and engines, while Rovan coordinated escape routes and repairs for the settlement. After the danger passed, the local leaders came to him, confused and grateful. "Why do you help us?" they asked. Rovan smiled faintly, looking at the dragons who had learned his lessons so well. "Because someone had to," he said simply. "Because it is stronger to protect than to destroy. Because life is worth saving even when it seems impossible." Veilrix chirped softly, nudging his hand in agreement. The bond they shared had grown deeper over the years. Lyrana's eyes scanned the skies, ever watchful, and Zareth flexed its wings, ready to act again. They had learned humanity, not as humans themselves but through trust, courage, and the choices of one man who refused to abandon them. Stories spread across star systems. Children heard of the human who had picked up dragon heirs in a desert and had refused to walk away. Pilots and explorers whispered of the dragons who flew not to conquer, but to guard the weak. Traders told tales of freighters saved, settlements protected, and empires reminded that power without compassion was meaningless. Humanity was no longer measured in fleets or armies, it was remembered in acts of courage and care. Rovan often stood on the deck of his freighter at night, watching the stars. He thought of the desert where he had first found the hatchlings, left to die under the twin suns. He remembered the heat, the fear, and the first bond that had formed when Veilrix had touched his hand. He had not known then that his actions would ripple across the galaxy, shaping the paths of dragon heirs and changing how species viewed humans. Sometimes the heirs would speak through their psychic bond, sharing visions of distant worlds and the lives they had saved. Other times they would simply rest beside him, wings folded, scales brushing gently against his shoulders. Rovan understood that they were no longer just his responsibility, they were partners, allies, and reminders that one choice could change everything. One evening, as they traveled through a newly charted system, the eldest heir, Lyrana, spoke in a thought pulse that Rovan felt directly in his mind. "The galaxy knows. They will remember. They will not forget the human who saved us." Rovan smiled, the weight of years and battles behind him, but the pride of their journey clear. The heirs had grown into something the galaxy had never expected. Guardians raised by a human, acting with intelligence, courage, and care. And the story of humanity, the quiet strength of a single man, was now part of the stars themselves. In time, historians would write of humans not as conquerors or weaklings, but as those who could see life's value and act to protect it, even against impossible odds. Pilots would tell of freighters guided by dragons who had been taught trust by a human mechanic. Children would dream of a world where one choice, one act of courage could echo through the galaxy. Rovan Hale, once abandoned and alone in a desert, had changed everything. The heirs had grown into legends, but the story always returned to him, the human who had shown them a different way to live. In the quiet of the freighter, under a sky filled with stars, he finally allowed himself a moment of peace. He had survived. He had protected. And humanity, in its simplest and strongest form, had been remembered. And among the stars, the galaxy whispered the truth it had forgotten for too long. Humans were not the strongest. They were not the most feared. But they were the ones who cared when no one else would. They were the ones who saved the impossible. And they were remembered.